All right, welcome to the My Sugar-Free Journey podcast. We are here today with Elliot Overton. So Elliot is a certified functional medicine practitioner. He's a naturopathic nutritional therapist, and he is one of these guys that is just interested in a wide range of subjects and how they affect health. And I heard him on another podcast, I'm going to say a couple months ago, maybe a month or two ago. I forget how long it was, and was really interested in what he had to say. But what he was talking about was mostly oxalates. And so as we got to talking about, I began to be more interested in all of the other things that he was interested in. So I'm going to have someone else on in a couple weeks to talk specifically about oxalates, but I want to talk to Elliot about some of the other things that he is into, because these are subjects that maybe don't get talked about as much, especially on this podcast. So Elliot, welcome to the show.
Hello. Well, thank you for having me.
Fantastic. So let's get into your background first of all. So what made you want to become a nutritionist, to get into this side of human health?
Okay. So I was originally a vegetarian from quite a young age, and I was kind of led to believe that this was a healthy way to be. You know, I generally thought that eating a whole foods vegetarian diet was going to keep me fit and healthy. And so I've always kind of had an interest in natural health, or trying to maintain health to some extent. But I went traveling. I went backpacking for 9 or 10 months through India and some of the rest of Asia. And I actually developed some severe digestive issues while I was there. When I came back to the UK, that kind of persisted, and I went to my doctor to see if anything could be sorted about that. And generally, they couldn't really help in many respects. So it was around that time that I kind of started looking into other ways to deal with digestive issues, see if there was anything that might kind of provide sustainable relief. And so I came across kind of Paleolithic or ancestral health kind of concepts with Weston A. Price Foundation and the ketogenic diet and everything. And from that point onward, I really just developed a keen interest in nutritional biochemistry and in learning about how the body works, but also how things can go wrong, especially with our modern lifestyles, our modern diets and things. And I did, for a very short period, kind of consider going on to study medicine, actually, but I quickly decided against that, because I kind of came to the conclusion that I didn't really want to just dispense medications for a living, you know. And in the UK, it can be quite difficult to step outside of the box, so to speak. So we don't have things like naturopathic doctors or anything. So I actually thought the best way that I could kind of help people improve their health and whatnot was actually by going the nutritional route. And so I decided to study nutrition, and the rest is history, I guess.
Where did you study?
I went to a private institution. It's not a university. It's something called the College of Naturopathic Medicine, and that's in the UK.
Okay. Well, good deal. So this kind of led you down the road towards studying human nutrition. Now, your interests are varied, and I want to talk first about a subject that is it's a hot button issue here in the States, because we're going to talk about glyphosate. Just I don't want to bury the lead. We're going to talk about glyphosate for a minute, and it's a hot button issue here in the States because we are in the middle of a very large trial that is happening, where Bayer is getting sued for basically giving a farmer cancer, and they lost. The farmer won, and they were able to, I guess, successfully prove that his cancer was directly related to the glyphosate that he was using on his crops, which is amazing to me. I cannot believe that they were actually able to prove that case, because that seems like such a very difficult case to prove. So when I was doing my research, like, what is glyphosate? What is it going on? Of course, we have all this, all this crazy stuff going on over here about, genetically modified, GMO crops, and is it affecting our health? Is the glyphosate damaging us on a DNA level, on a cellular level? Is it giving us cancer? There's a lot of back and forth. People don't really know the answers to it. So I wanted to get somebody on here who's at least got some level of expertise about glyphosate and what it's doing to the human body. So let's start with probably the first thing that I saw was a very direct correlation between the amount of glyphosate used on American crops and the rates of obesity, cancer, and pretty much all the diseases of civilization that I usually attribute to to eating carbs. But if you're in America and you're eating carbs, you're probably eating GMO crops, and you're probably eating glyphosate applied crops. So there might be some carryover between these two risk factors. So let's get into, first of all, what is glyphosate, and then maybe get into, is it something that we need to be concerned with?
Well, yeah. So this is a very complex topic. I'd like to say that, if there are any listeners interested in this, really the researcher who has gone into the most depths with this is a brilliant researcher over at MIT. Her name is Dr. Stephanie Seneff, and so she's written several papers on this topic, and really, real quick. Yeah. I mean, you should get her on for an interview. If I'm sure she'd be happy to speak to you about this. Definitely. But ultimately, she's written several papers on this topic and goes into really the depth of it. And in a short answer, glyphosate is extremely toxic. Okay, it's extremely toxic. Now, if I remember correctly, glyphosate, the basics of glyphosate are, it is essentially what you call an amino acid analog. Okay, so it's very similar to the amino acid glycine. Okay, the body might actually interpret it as glycine. And if I remember correctly, glyphosate was patented originally as a mineral chelator. Okay. I think that's correct, if my memory is correct. But essentially what it does, they're using it, it's a herbicide. So they are spraying it on the crops, and it's acting on a pathway. It's acting on prokaryotic organisms. So essentially, you have eukaryotes, such as human beings and other kind of multicellular organisms, but then you have prokaryotes, and these are bacteria and things. And so essentially what glyphosate is doing is it's having a direct effect on the metabolic pathways of certain bacteria, okay? So there is, bacteria have an enzyme called EPSP synthase. Okay, so this is essentially part of their metabolism. It's how they are producing amino acids and whatnot, and basically thriving. And so glyphosate has a direct effect on this. It basically kills off certain types of bacteria. And because of this, much of the research, or many scientists have basically proposed that it's safe for human beings, because it's not acting on human cells per se. A lot of the research was basically showing, okay, it's damaging to bacteria, but it's not having any direct effect on human cells. But what we now know about the microbiome, with the decades of research that's coming out, is that actually the bacteria which occupy the human body, which are inside the gut, which are on the skin, which are potentially inside every single type of organ, the balance of bacteria is extraordinarily important. And I'm not sure that anyone really knows how that is, but we just know whatever it is, it's right. There's a tight-knit relationship between human beings and certain kind of microorganisms.
So we have 10 times as much bacteria in our body, on our body, than we do have human cells. So we're basically just a host for a bunch of bacteria. Correct?
Yeah, indeed. And there's many researchers who are referring to the human body as now like what they call a hollow biome. So actually, like, it's just this big conglomeration of all of these different microorganisms and whatnot. And so, yeah, that's kind of all really new stuff. But essentially, so as I was saying, glyphosate is basically disrupting the metabolism of the bacteria. So just on that front, if we look at if you are to ingest glyphosate, if you look at the kinds of effects it's having on the bacteria, um, there's a very tight correlation, or if you look at the statistics for something like celiac disease or something like autism, there's a very close correlation between glyphosate usage and autism diagnosis. And so
Right.
if you look at, say, for instance, the research on autism, on the autistic microbiome, so to speak, the gut microbes which are present in autistic children, they have found that certain pathogens or certain types of bacteria are generally more present. So you have like the bilophilia, or for instance, there is various types of Clostridia bacteria. And what these bacteria are essentially doing in the gut is they are metabolizing dietary components and releasing certain types of phenols. One of those is called HPHBA, or there's also P-creosol. And what these are doing is essentially, or it's theorized at least, is that in the autistic gut, you're having these phenols being produced by these Clostridia bacteria, and they're essentially getting into the bloodstream and getting into the brain, and they are altering the brain's ability to metabolize dopamine. What they actually do is they inhibit an enzyme called dopamine beta hydroxylase. And so dopamine in high amounts is potentially going to turn into what we call a free radical. It's actually going to damage the brain. And so there is a researcher called Dr. William Shaw, and he is the head of a lab over at Great Plains Laboratory. And so, you know, his theory is that actually autism, one of the driving factors, may actually be this kind of bacteria in the gut. Now, I'm not sure if I necessarily agree with that one, but ultimately, what we see is that glyphosate, when someone consumes glyphosate, it has been shown to kill off the so-called beneficial microbes. So it has like a selective action. It's not killing everything. It's having a selective action whereby it's having a detrimental effect on certain microbes which are said to be beneficial. I think lactobacillus and a couple of the other ones are particularly susceptible to glyphosate. But what it's also doing is it seems to promote the growth of these kinds of pathogens like Clostridia. Okay, so that is just one aspect to this. We know that glyphosate is directly causing a kind of imbalance or a dysbiosis in the gut. But in fact, it's a lot worse than that. Okay, so glyphosate, if you recall me saying, glyphosate is an amino acid analog. So it's an analog of glycine. Okay, so essentially, Stephanie Seneff, one of her proposals, and I think it makes a lot of sense when you kind of look at the evidence for that, is that what is potentially happening is that when we are consuming glyphosate, because of a similar kind of molecular configuration, our body is interpreting that as glycine. Okay, now amino acids, basically, when you eat dietary proteins, say you eat a steak, you are going to break that down with your digestive enzymes, your stomach acid, into a variety of amino acids. They are going to be absorbed. And then what you're going to do is you're essentially going to decide what you need to do with those amino acids. So, for instance, you may want to take the amino acid glycine and turn it into glutathione, which is an antioxidant. You may want to incorporate glycine into collagen, which is like the primary structural tissue of the body. Yeah, it's like the most abundant protein. You may want to also take glycine and form certain types of enzymes. Okay, so you're using amino acids for all of these different purposes to make your own proteins. And now, if you think, right, if the human body is interpreting glyphosate actually as glycine, what is potentially going to happen, and this is Seneff's theory, is that the body is potentially going to incorporate glycine into the proteins that it's making. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And it only makes sense. I mean, it makes sense because of how you're explaining it. But I actually supplement glycine. I started doing it probably a year ago, and have seen some interesting effects. And I actually use it as a sweetener sometimes in my tea, because glycine is very, it's not very sweet, but it's a little sweet. And if you don't eat sugar, then glycine, it's the right amount of sweetness. So the idea, like the reason I was doing that was, well, because number one, Chris Masterjohn told me to, and I'll just do whatever he says. But the other reason is because it helps with muscle synthesis, and there's a lot of different pathways that it affects in the body. So the idea that there could be this chemical that is acting like a Trojan horse that is going along the same pathways of glycine is really, really troubling. In fact, I'm going to have Chris Masterjohn on in about 2 or 3 weeks. I'm definitely going to talk to him a little bit more about this, because that's interesting. Because there's many beneficial aspects to glycine, and the idea that there would be something that would do all of the same things that glycine does, but do it in a bad way as opposed to a good way is very troubling.
Well, yeah, this is the hypothesis anyway, is that essentially when you're incorporating this fake glycine in the form of glyphosate into a protein, that protein is not going to work the way that you need it to work.
Right.
Okay. And
it's not folded quite right. Exactly.
Exactly. And so the various things that you're going to make, like enzymes, are potentially going to go bust. They might be less robust. They might actually you may just have to make a new protein altogether. I mean, no one actually knows what this is because there's so little research on it. But as part of the one of Senef's colleagues, if I remember correctly, was talking about how essentially in support of this theory, some evidence for this is that actually what they've done is taken digestive enzyme supplements, okay, and they've basically cracked open the capsules and tested them in a lab. And what they've actually found is that there is glyphosate in the digestive enzymes. Okay, so what is potentially happening is that if you are producing digestive enzymes, or if an animal, say where you are extracting the digestive enzymes from, if that animal is incorporating the glyphosate, which is sprayed on the feed, into the enzymes that are meant to break down the food, and we extract those enzymes, that is potentially a method by which you are going to find glyphosate in a cap of digestive enzymes. Now, there could be another way, but that is one possibility. And it's potentially the case that, many people think of glyphosate and you look where glyphosate is sprayed. Yeah. So you think wheat, corn, oats, various other kinds of grains, some of the fruits. It's really ubiquitous, especially in the United States. But essentially, you think that if you avoided those foods, then you're potentially avoiding the glyphosate exposure. Right. But what is actually potentially happening is that by eating animals who eat glyphosate sprayed grains, because that's what most of them are fed these days, grain fed, you are, if those animals are incorporating glyphosate into their collagen, then you're potentially getting that. All right. So that's kind of one of the reasons why I really recommend going grass-fed, organic if possible. It's not, not everyone has the funds to do that, but I would say that it's probably going to be safer. Okay. Now, aside from this is, when you look at glyphosate, look at the literature on it, there is so much there, but another one of the main points is actually related to one of the nutrients. This nutrient is called sulfate. Okay, so the way that you can think of it is glyphosate is like sulfate's worst enemy. Okay, so sulfate is a nutrient, and actually it's a sulfate and sulfur. They're basically the same thing, but sulfate is an oxidized form of sulfur. And when you think of sulfur, sulfur is an element is found in proteins. So the majority of dietary sulfur is coming in from methionine and cysteine, but there's also the
Oh, I thought
sulfurous
it was like vegetables, yeah, sulfurous vegetables. That's where
yeah.
I have it in my head, like onions and things like that, right? Garlic.
Yeah. Garlic, onions, the brassica cruciferous vegetables.
Okay.
Okay, so but the main source is actually methionine and cysteine. So
Okay.
what you can do is when you consume these things, what you're doing is when you're breaking them down, you can actually run them through several pathways, and really what you're going to get from that, what the main benefit that you're going to get from that in many cases is actually converting the sulfurous compounds, the various compounds that contain sulfur, and actually deriving sulfate. Okay, so sulfate is a type of sulfur. And when you've got sulfate, this is what you're using to, I mean, there's so many functions of this. There's a pathway called sulfation. So when we talk about sulfation, people generally ascribe sulfation to actually be detoxification. So it's a pathway by which the liver is taking various kind of hormones, toxins and whatnot, taking this sulfate molecule and actually bonding it together with it and actually carrying it out. So it's one way that you detoxify stuff. Okay, that's a conjugation reaction. But what you can also do with sulfate, or what you do with it, is you're producing structural elements such as these things called glycosaminoglycans. And these kind of are dotted on the exterior of the cell. And they essentially are really important for the structure of the human body, all right? And they're also important for a bunch of other reasons, which is kind of related to the biophysics of that, but I won't go there just yet. So on a purely biochemical level, sulfate is really important, okay? And glyphosate seems to act in opposition to our body's ability to process sulfate in just a variety of ways, okay? So we're taking in dietary forms of sulfur, and what we have to do is run it through these steps to get this activated sulfate. And one of those steps is actually an enzyme whereby we take an intermediate called sulfite and convert it into sulfate. And the enzyme is called sulfite oxidase. Okay. So people might have heard of sulfite oxidase in the context of having kind of sulfur overload reactions, like when they eat sulfurous food or when they eat like wine, which has a sulfite additive, like a preservative or sulfur dioxide, and they get loads of reactions. Generally, they're told to take molybdenum, okay, because for that enzyme to work, you need molybdenum as a cofactor. Well, essentially, what glyphosate does is it's a mineral chelator. So it's binding with various dietary minerals. One of those is molybdenum, another one is manganese. It binds with iron and zinc and all of these other kind of things. But in this context, it's binding with molybdenum, and it is potentially blocking the function of this sulfite oxidase enzyme. So it's disrupting our ability to take these forms of sulfur and actually convert them into this active form. But at the same time, what it's also doing is it's causing us to waste sulfur. It's potentially wasting sulfur, inhibiting the absorption of sulfate. And there are just so many ways when you look at the mechanisms, glyphosate can really, really disrupt sulfation. And we were talking before about a very strong correlation between autism and glyphosate.
Right.
Well, in autism, there is also, it's very well established that these children have really poor sulfation. Like sulfur metabolism is just usually, I mean, if you compare glutathione levels, so the way that you're making glutathione, which is the antioxidant, you make that using sulfur amino acids. And if you look at the glutathione levels of a child with autism, they are typically much lower, or let's say the reduced glutathione. So the one that you can use as an antioxidant, it's much lower than in healthy children. And there's lots of other markers which kind of demonstrate that actually these children have a very strong sulfur deficiency. Now, this is just simply on a biochemical level, but when we actually look more in the realm of biophysics, sulfur is absolutely essential for maintaining blood flow. Okay, so this is something that not many people talk about. Senef does have a very good paper on it, and I actually made a video kind of presentation on my YouTube channel about this. Now, essentially, when we think of blood flow, what we're generally taught is that the heart is a pump. Okay, so the heart is pumping the blood, and it's the pressure generated from the heartbeat, which is actually allowing the blood to go through the arteries and whatnot, and go through the capillaries. And then you moving your muscles and things is actually drawing the blood back through the veins, back to the lungs, and then to the heart and whatnot. And that's basically what anyone who learns about anatomy and physiology is taught. Well, it turns out that there have been several calculations done that like demonstrating that the heartbeat is the pumping action of the heart is in no way strong enough to be able to pump blood all throughout the body. Like if you spread out the body, all the capillaries, all the vessels, I mean, the surface area is the distance that the blood needs to travel is unbelievable. And these are really small. Like if you look at the capillaries, it's like the size of it's thinner than one blood cell. Okay, so it's like almost impossible, according to the mechanism that we're taught, that the blood would be able to shift a blood cell through that small space. And so there have been there's a whole nother way of kind of looking at this. And essentially it's relating to, as I said, it's more in the realm of biophysics than it is biochemistry. And essentially it has to do with the effect that sulfate is having on neighboring water molecules. Okay, so essentially, are you familiar with the work of Dr. Gerald Pollack?
No.
Right, okay, so I'll just a brief overview. Right, okay, so the water in the human body is not like the water in a cup of water. Okay, so the water in a cup of water, a glass of water, is referred to as bulk water. Okay, so if you poured it, if you tilted it upside down, it would come out of the glass.
Right.
But essentially, the water inside the human body is not like that. Okay, it's in the past couple of decades, and really they've been working on this for many years, is that actually when water is in a living system, it's the same as if in a tree or in a plant or whatnot. When water is in a living system, it actually forms like a gel state. It's called the fourth phase of water. And so Dr. Gerald Pollack has been one of the main proponents of this. You know, he was the one who kind of really introduced this concept to the public, but it's been known for quite a while, and there's been lots of different theories. Essentially, it has to do with water taking on a different structure, a bit like in between the liquid phase and the ice phase. It's like a gel. Like a jello, essentially, in the US, as you call it. Yeah. And this kind of gel-like phase of water actually it seems to act like a battery. Okay, so it can basically hold energy. It can hold electromagnetic energy in the form of electrons, and it can essentially transfer that energy. It's almost like very much like a battery. And what they found is that it's essentially infrared light or sunlight. Infrared light being generated from our mitochondria, different kinds of light can actually, the photons are actually stored in this water phase, in this water battery, and they can be put to use. Okay, so there's lots of work into how this all functions, but essentially when we're looking at the concept of sulfate, how it is or why it is really important for blood flow, sulfate has a very dense negative charge. Okay, so sulfate is referred to as a cosmotrope. The cosmotrope, according to something called the Hofmeister series, is basically, in simple terms, it's the ability of an ion to structure neighboring water molecules to form this gel-like phase. And so sulfur, when it's incorporated into glycosaminoglycans, the glycosaminoglycans are basically lining the blood vessels. Okay, so you have something called the glycocalyx. Glycocalyx inside the blood vessels is lined with these like hairs, you could say, all right, lined with these hairs. And these are dotted with sulfate, okay, sulfated glycosaminoglycans. And the sulfate, which is dotted on the hairs, is essentially allowing the inside of the blood vessel to form like this gel-like phase of water, like lining the structure, okay?
Okay.
And what this is essentially doing is it's providing a very kind of flexible barrier. It's allowing the blood cells to flow freely through the vessel without attaching to the blood vessel wall, okay? If you've got this thick, dense layer of like exclusion zone water in the blood vessel, then essentially the blood cell is not going to stick. It's actually going to be repelled, okay? Because on the surface of the blood cell, you also have something called cholesterol sulfate. And cholesterol sulfate at the same time holds a very negative charge. So if you were to take two magnets and you were to get the negative end and then the negative end and try to put them together, what would happen?
They'd repel.
You get repel, and that is exactly what happens with the blood vessel. There's this dense negative charge on the outside of, kind of on the inner lining of the blood vessel, and then the dense charge on the blood cell. It's actually preventing the blood cell from sticking to the inner lining of the vessel to get like a, forming plaque or whatnot, or like a thrombosis. So it's essential for the blood not to clot. But at the same time, this kind of biophysical effect, I explain it a lot more in the presentation I've done on my channel, but essentially there is a biophysical effect which essentially propels the blood cells through the vessel, okay? So it's not just the heart which is pumping this. And so sulfate, in simple terms, sulfate is absolutely 100% essential for blood flow. And that when you have excessive amounts of glyphosate, what this is potentially doing is it's screwing with your ability to transport sulfate. It's screwing with your ability to absorb sulfate. It's generally, it seems to be one of the most damaging things that human beings could have come up with. And now more and more research is coming out whereby what they're finding is correlations between glyphosate use and a whole host of other diseases. Anthony Samsel and Senef, they've written so many papers with connections to many of the, I guess, what you'd call modern diseases of the time,
So you're talking specifically about cardiovascular disease. I mean, that seems to be what you're describing. So some of these things that keep getting blamed on cholesterol, like the clogs in the arteries and the high blood pressure and things like this. You're saying that glyphosate is at least playing a role in that as well?
Well, when you look at what it's doing to sulfur metabolism, and then when you look at the effect that sulfur has on the cardiovascular system on maintaining, cardiovascular health, you put two and two together and it would only kind of make sense that would be the case. There have also been several papers being written about that topic. Specifically, I think that glyphosate could certainly be involved in this, and generally the problems are blamed on cholesterol and saturated fat.
Yeah. So this is kind of, it interests me because I've seen several papers that would suggest that. So one of the issues with high blood pressure is the blood vessels themselves don't expand and contract as much with each beat as they should. That's usually blamed on high insulin levels. So you have high insulin levels. It makes the muscles around the blood vessels contract and not expand as much. There's not as much room for the blood to go through, and especially the systolic number on your blood pressure tends to rise very, very quickly if you have a diet high in insulin or high in insulin, producing foods. So if you have that diet, you almost certainly have a diet that's high in glyphosate as well. And so we might have a situation where these two things are acting in in parallel with each other, that you have the high insulin levels, but you also have these high glyphosate problems as well. And this what I think would explain, and I'm just kind of thinking it through, this would explain why we have other societies that can eat a high carb diet, like the Japanese that are eating a lot of rice and things like that, and not see the problems with obesity and not see the problems with cardiovascular disease that we are seeing in the United States. It also might explain why other societies that eat a high carb diet, like in India, they're almost entirely vegetarian, and lately they've seen a huge increase in their number of type 2 diabetes cases, their number of other cardiovascular issues, and I know that they have increased the amount of glyphosate that they're using on their food supply as well. So there might be something to this, that we're explaining things in a way that it certainly doesn't let insulin off the hook, but insulin and glyphosate might be working together to damage our health even more. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it seems multifaceted, and I think it's very difficult to kind of pinpoint exactly what the problem is, but it seems like it's a conglomeration of everything, coupled with, what we're going to talk about in a little while, coupled with the fact that what we've done is we've adopted non-native EMF, which is, come along practically the same time as glyphosate. Yeah. And so it's really difficult to say, which one came first, which one's having the most effect. Right. I think the problem really with glyphosate is that it's very difficult to get rid of. Yeah. It's really difficult for the body. Like, what it essentially does is it gets bound up like by the gut microbes. Okay. And there have been a couple of ways which I'm kind of looking into. There's a couple of animal studies which have shown that using certain types of, for instance, using sauerkraut juice, which contains acetobacter, that supposedly can degrade glyphosate. There's also fulvic and humic acids. There's a couple other things like perhaps bentonite clay or activated charcoal might help to clear that stuff out. But essentially, it's unknown territory. And, I think it's very difficult to kind of, not enough research has been done on it, quite frankly.
Right. Well, we've got, Bayer or whoever owned glyphosate before Bayer bought it, because I know they just recently bought it. They've been actively opposing this type of research, and they're certainly not funding it. If the company that is that's putting it out isn't doing the research, it's hard to get public funding for the type of research that needs to be done on this. So it wouldn't surprise me at all to find out that we could be decades away from really understanding the problems of glyphosate on our body, and so especially when we have an issue like this, sometimes you have to jump out ahead of the science and make the best decisions for your health based on the available, and it might be anecdotal evidence, and try to do the best that you can. That's how I got into eating low carb. When I first started doing it, there wasn't a whole lot of science on it, but it seemed to work for enough people that I wanted to jump in and do it. And glyphosate we might put glyphosate in that same category. There might not be the evidence, the hard, the RCMs, the studies that show that glyphosate is damaging to the human body, but there might be enough anecdotal evidence. Especially the real smoking gun for me at this point is the correlations. There's massive correlations, very clear and striking correlations between glyphosate use and all of the diseases of civilization that we tend to blame on grains and sugar consumption. Well, what if it's not just the grains and sugar consumption? What if it's also the pesticide that we're putting on the grains and the sugar that's working in tandem to really affect our bodies and really destroy our bodies? So it's an interesting issue that we've got.
And there's this whole thing about non-celiac gluten sensitivity now,
Mm-hmm.
and it seems like everyone is sensitive to gluten. And I'm not a fan of wheat. I'm not a fan of gluten. But quite frankly, now there are arguments to say that, okay, what we've done is we've increased the amount of gluten. We've kind of
Right.
produced hybrid.
Dwarf wheat. And, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so there is that. But at the same time, um, there are mechanisms laid out by which glyphosate could, I mean, very easily, theoretically, induce something like non-celiac gluten sensitivity. It can have effects on tryptophan metabolism. So it disrupts the metabolism of tryptophan, which is involved in obesity, which is involved in satiety. There are literally, I don't have time to go through all of the mechanisms, but actually there are so many mechanisms, or there's so much kind of theoretical basis. And I think you made a really good point that, quite frankly, for one, I'm not going to wait for peer-reviewed evidence to start making decisions, because that could take 30 years.
Right.
That could take 30 years, because that's generally how long it takes for something new to actually be incorporated into advice. So I think what we need to do is really take responsibility and ultimately be overly cautious. I really think that we do.
Yeah, I think so. Especially when you take into account that we don't need grains or sugar in our diet. I mean, if this was something that was affecting, if we found out that steak was bad for us, that would be a problem, because red meat or something like that, because we would need that's a fundamental part of our diet. But we don't need grains. We don't need sugar, and I'm not a carnivore, but I am starting to lean towards, I don't know that we need a whole lot of any vegetables at all in our diet. They don't seem to be, they seem to be fun to eat, at times, but they don't seem to be necessary. Like, look, because there's many, many people who get along just fine and they don't eat any green matter whatsoever. So
I don't eat any green matter.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem to be necessary. I still do because I like it, but
right,
it doesn't seem to be a big deal. So if the only part of the story that concerns me is the fact that we are feeding this glyphosate, sprayed corn and silage or whatever to our cows, and who knows what effect that is having. But that's at least being digested and broken down by another organism that's not us before it gets incorporated into the body of the animal. And a cow's digestive system is pretty intense. So I mean they break down a lot of stuff. So that might be a buffer that between us and glyphosate, those of us that are eating this way. So that's good news. Let's just talk about cows for a minute. What, if anything, like if you were going to design a study to really understand the impact of glyphosate on ruminant animals, do you have any idea what that would look like?
I have no idea. I mean,
Okay.
I can guess.
Yeah.
Maybe what you might do is take two groups of cows from birth. You'd feed one pure grass or grains that had not had any exposure to glyphosate. And then what you do is you'd feed another set of cows glyphosate sprayed grains. You'd let them live for however long, slaughter them. And then what you'd do is you'd examine the different types of tissues. So the collagen, the bones, the muscle meat, the organs. And I guess you would make the determination. I don't know how that would work in real life, because I'm not sure exactly how you test glyphosate in the lab. But I'd imagine that, wouldn't be too difficult to do, is actually see if you can isolate glyphosate from like the muscle meat or from the bone broth or something like that.
Interesting.
I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's fine. I thought maybe I'd just throw that out there. Well, I was going to talk to you. You mentioned about these non-native EMF fields. I was going to talk to you about that. There's no way we're getting into that. So I will. What I'm going to do is, if you want, I'm going to have you back on in a few weeks, and we can talk about 5G and some of the other EMF fields that we have. we have that we're dealing with today. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's perfectly fine.
Okay, perfect.
I think that I would say that stuff is probably even more problematic than glyphosate. I really would.
Man, don't tell me that.
No, I mean, at least you can control your exposure to somewhat, and glyphosate is actually
Yeah.
it's a physical thing. Whereas the EMFs, I think that is actually really the major problem. I think it's probably more of a problem than any kind of food that we're eating. So that's definitely something that, yeah, I'd be happy to talk about.
What if we found out that those people that are wearing tinfoil hats were the smartest ones of all? That they had they had a way to protect themselves. Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, Elliot, thank you so much for coming on. We're going to cut this off right here. If we haven't scared you enough about glyphosate, I do, and I know if you're listening to this podcast, you've probably already made this switch. But let me just encourage you for multiple reasons. Don't eat sugar. Don't eat grains. Don't eat polyunsaturated fats. Don't, the canola oil, the corn oil, all that stuff. None of it is good for you. And eat a diet full of red meat, dark white meat, and take care of your health that way. Elliot, any last words for us?
No, that's pretty good advice. Yeah, pretty good advice.
Perfect.
Can't think of anything. Can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Tell my listeners. Actually, you know what? I probably should have started with this question, just to change subjects a little bit. Tell us, like, what you do. What is your business? What do you do? And if my listeners would like to find out more about you and maybe use some of your services, how can they do all that?
Yeah, so I consult with people who essentially want to improve their health. So that is, people with any kind of chronic health condition who's been through the system and hasn't found benefits. I typically work with people who diet alone isn't really enough. I do think that for many people, diet can go a really great way, but quite frankly, it doesn't seem to be sufficient for many people. And it seems that they actually need some extra support, potentially in terms of if they've had any chronic toxicity, anything like that, then that's the kind of thing that I do with people. I have a website called www.eonutrition.co.uk. That's where I write articles on this kind of stuff. And I also have a YouTube channel, and that's youtube.com/eonutrition. On there, I started it maybe in January, and I'm starting to make some more videos. So I kind of do presentations and interviews and that kind of stuff. So yeah, you can find me there, and yeah.
Every week I think I should do more YouTube videos, and then I don't do any more YouTube videos. So I feel it. Okay, perfect. Guys, we're going to put links to everything he mentioned there in the show notes. You can find that at mysugarfreejourney.com/podcast. And lots of links to everything that he mentioned. So good stuff there. Elliot, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Now, those of you that are listening, hold on. We'll be right back with some more information.